bet. I'm sure it doesn't always work. Okay, so hi everybody. My name's Froschauer. I work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. My office is in Lacey, Washington, so I'm out in Washington State, about an hour away from Seattle, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about my favorite animals, bats. So whenever I tell people, usually the first time that I work with bats, they usually say something like, "You work with what?" And then I tell them I work with bats, and half the people say something like, "Oh, that's cool," but a lot of people still say, "Ooh, that's gross." So hopefully by the end of today, I can maybe change your mind if you're in the "Ooh, that's gross" camp, and maybe you can help me share the word that bats are really cool. So first, I'll tell you a little bit about what I do. I'm a communication specialist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That means I work with scientists, the media, the public, and that includes students. And I've been doing the NBTI for a couple years now, and it's one of my favorite things. So I'm so glad that you all are here today to learn a little bit about bats. And my main job is to communicate about wildlife issues. And one of those issues is related to bats. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But in addition to my regular job, I also work with bats at night. So I work with biologists and scientists on bat research projects, and I work with a couple different outreach organizations to help educate people about bats and why they're so important. So basically, I like to think of myself like a wildlife superhero, which is a pretty cool job. So for folks that might be interested in working with bats or any other kind of animals, sometimes people ask me, how do you get a job working for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or with wildlife? So the way that I did that was that I studied natural resources at The Ohio State University. I studied biology, ecology, and wildlife management. And there actually are several different universities around the country and around the world that study bats and have bat labs. So if you're really interested in bats, you can always find some schools that focus on some of their programs on bats. So we'll talk a little bit about bats worldwide, and then I'll talk a little bit more about bats here in North America. So worldwide, there are over 1,300 species of bats. Pretty amazing. They discover more every year, which is a really cool thing about bats, I think, too. That makes up over a fifth of all the mammal species. So other than rodents, bats have the most species diversity of any mammals. And bats live almost everywhere on Earth, except for most extreme desert and polar regions. There are two major groups of bats. There's the megabats and the microbats. And it's just kind of like their name sounds. Megabats are the big bats. Roof bats, a lot of the flying foxes and things are megabats. And then there are microbats, which are small little bats. And that's what we have here in North America, microbats. Just to give you an idea of some of the different types of bats that we have in the world, this is the smallest bat. It's called a bumblebee bat. It's actually the smallest mammal in the world, we think, and it actually weighs less than a penny, which is pretty tiny. And these guys live in Thailand and Burma. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have flying foxes. These guys have a 6-foot wingspan, and they live in the Philippines. But even though they have that really giant 6-foot wingspan, they still only weigh about 3 pounds. I also think bats are really cute, so I like to show these guys, because if you aren't sure how you feel about bats, how can you look at that little face and not think that bats are cute? I think these are the cutest bats, although there are tons and tons of different species of bats that are very handsome, very adorable. These are some of my favorites. They're Honduran tent-making bats. And you can see there in the picture, they actually make, in the day, when they're roosting in the day, they make this little tent. They chew along the top of a big leaf, and it folds over, and they get up under inside of there, so they aren't visible from above from flying predators, and the light filtering through the leaf gives them sort of a greenish cast, which makes them less visible to predators that are on the ground too. So pretty smart way to camouflage yourself. Yeah, they are the cutest. They're like little marshmallows with little yellow noses and ears. So bats are really beneficial. They're hard at work all around the world, even if you don't see them. They provide pest control for crops like corn and tomatoes and watermelon, lots of things we like to eat. They also pollinate plants like avocados, bananas, and cashews, some of my favorite things. And in the tropics especially, they're really important for helping to disperse seeds. So what do bats eat? Well, most of them eat insects. About 2/3 of the species of bats actually eat insects. Here in North America, almost all of our bats eat insects. Other ones eat pollen or fruit and nectar. There are a few meat-eating bats. They'll actually eat frogs and fish. And then there are 3 species of bats that live in Latin America that feed on blood, vampire bats. They're not like the vampires that we see in movies that latch onto somebody's neck and suck all their blood, and there's no vampire cows in the morning after vampire bats are feeding. They actually eat just about a tablespoon of blood a night. I'm going to talk a little bit more about insect-eating bats because that's mainly what we have here in the U.S. and in North America. They're a primary predator of night-flying insects. If you think about it, there really aren't a lot of birds that are active at night. There's owls, but owls generally eat small mammals. There's some birds like nighthawks and nightjars, but for the most part, birds are not active at night. So bats are the primary predator of night-flying insects, which makes them really important. They specialize, some different bats specialize in different kinds of insects. So there's some bats that prefer moths, there are bats that prefer beetles, there are bats that prefer flies or aquatic insects, and there's some bats that are generalists, so they eat a little bit of everything. And bats are really, they eat a lot. They can eat up to their body weight in insects in one night. So for me, or for you, if you had to eat your body weight in one night, I don't think I could do it. I'm willing to try because I really love pizza, but I'd have to eat about 50 large pizzas in order to eat like a bat. So I'll get working on that later, but probably not going to get through 50 large pizzas tonight. I want to talk a little bit about what makes bats special. There's so many things that makes bats special that I can't even begin to get through them in the hour that we have today, but I'll touch on just a few things. The first thing that makes them really special, of course, is that they're the only flying mammal. So there are a couple other mammals that glide, like flying, like sugar gliders and like flying squirrels, but they don't actually fly, they just glide. But bats actually have flight. So if you look at the picture there, you can see that their wings are made of bones that are exactly the same as the bones in our hand, except if we have really long fingers. So if you stretched your fingers down to the floor, that would be like bat wings fingers. And because they have all those joints like we have in our hands, their wings are really flexible and really agile, and that makes them really exceptional flyers. So they can make their wings in lots of different shapes, which birds can't do because their wings are pretty fixed. So they're a lot more agile flyers than birds. Bats also use echolocation to navigate, communicate, and hunt. So you've probably heard that saying, blind as a bat. That's actually not true. So next time you hear somebody say that, you can actually correct them. Bats have eyesight similar to human beings. But when it's dark outside, obviously that's not going to be that useful for trying to navigate and hunt. So they actually echolocate. So they use sound waves to see at night. And because they're the main predator of night-flying insects, they use this sound to navigate, but it also helps them find their insect prey. And one of the things I think is really, really cool about bat echolocation is that it's really, really fine. They can actually tell what size something is, what direction it's flying, and they can actually echolocate something and decide whether or not it's the kind of bug that they want to eat. So I think that's pretty cool. I see some questions over there. I'm going to wait until we get to the end, and then I'll come back to the questions. Okay, so bats are also really important to science. We study bats for lots and lots of different reasons. For example, the military studies bats for flight and navigation. As I mentioned, they have these really amazing wings, so the military often studies bat flight to try to help make human flying machines more efficient, make them have better navigation systems, develop lighter weight, more flexible materials for wings, and things like that. Actually, I just saw a story this week about a bat drone that they designed after a bat, so that might be something you can check out later. We also studied bats for medicine. Remember those vampire bats I talked about a few minutes ago? They actually have a special compound in their saliva. So what they do is at night they land either on the ground or on a branch, and they sneak up on their prey. They have two really sharp little teeth in the front, and they make a little slit. It's almost like a paper cut. And then they start lapping that cut with their tongue. And the special compound that they have in their saliva keeps the blood flowing. So researchers have been able to extract that compound, that enzyme, and actually create medicine that helps human stroke victims. Okay, so here in the US, we have about 47 species of bats. Most of those are insectivores. They eat insects, about 90% of them. We have a couple of fruit, nectar, and pollinating bats down in the desert Southwest. And I love this little spotted bat on the left. It's so cute. They have black and white polka dot fur and these really gigantic pink ears. I just think they're really good-looking bats. Here in the US, we also have, generally speaking, two types of bats. We have hibernating bats. These bats that live when they live in colder climates in the winter, you can imagine what happens when it gets really cold. There's really not a lot of bugs out, so they have to figure out a way to survive the winter. So some of the bats use hibernation as a winter survival strategy. So they hibernate in places like caves and mines. Those are called hibernacula. Some bats also will hibernate in rock crevices, on cliff faces. Some will hibernate in old buildings. And while they're in hibernation, bats slow down a lot of their body functions. So their breathing, their heart rate, their body temperature, and that helps them conserve fat to live through the winter. It's also likely that during that time, their immune systems are really reduced, and that'll be important in just a few minutes when I talk about a disease that's affecting some of our bats here in North America. And one thing I wanted to point out, when bats are hibernating, I think a lot of people have this idea that they go into their cave or their mine and they go into hibernation and they stay in that state all winter, but actually bats will wake up, come out of their hibernation, arouse from their hibernation a couple times during the winter and sort of move around. Sometimes they'll urinate to get rid of some of the toxins in their body. Sometimes they'll drink a little water if it's available, and then they go back into hibernation. The other way that bats can survive winter in cold climates where there's not a lot of food available is that they can actually migrate to different places where there may be food available. So some bats might migrate short distances, either between their summer roosts and their hibernacula. Some may migrate to long distances to where food is available all winter. For example, there's some bats that will migrate way down south into Mexico, so they can go really long distances to migrate to find food. And then some bats might migrate shorter distances just to a more temperate part of their range where there might be insects available. So they may not be long distance migrators. They may just go a short distance where they can still find food. So we'll talk a little bit about what threats are out there for bats. Surprise, humans are the biggest threat to bats. We've got a huge world population. We just surpassed 7 billion people. And all those people require lots of resources, which means for bats, a lot of loss of habitat. So we're losing land, habitat to land conversion. So when people are cutting down forests to build homes or put in agricultural fields or for resources that they need to build homes and schools and things like that, we're losing habitat to cave modification. So maybe digging open a cave where they might be putting a building in, or sealing caves in the past. Sometimes that's happened. Hopefully not as much now that we know more about cave systems, because there are lots of things, not just that rely on caves for their habitat. Catastrophic loss of natural roosts. As our climate's changing, we're experiencing more severe weather events. We're losing some of that habitat to some of those severe weather events, and bats have been forced to adapt to humans quite a bit. So oftentimes old buildings, old barns, old structures underneath bridges, bats will be forced to use these types of roosts because their natural habitat has been destroyed. So when we destroy these buildings and other things that they may depend on, we're also destroying habitat that bats have adapted to using. Some of the other threats to bats out there, pesticides. So pesticides either get into water sources. Bats are mammals. They require water just like humans. So a lot of times pesticides run off into streams and rivers and sources of fresh water that bats depend on. They can actually also get pesticides when they're eating insects. And unfortunately, pesticides tend to accumulate in fatty tissues in mammals. And because bats are mammals and because they feed their young milk just like humans, they can actually pass those toxins from their body into their body of their young. So pesticides are a real problem, as are other forms of pollution, air and water pollution. These are things that can affect bats. Disturbance is another big problem for bats, especially when bats are hibernating in the winter. Disrupting their hibernation can actually cause them to use up some of those fat reserves. So they really only have a small amount of fat that will allow them to survive through the winter. And I mentioned before, they do actually arouse from hibernation a couple times, and that's kind of built into their budget of the fat that they have for the winter. But if they get disturbed other times on top of that, it can actually cause them to burn up a lot of that fat. So coming out of hibernation, arousing from hibernation uses a lot of energy, just like turning on a car uses fuel and electricity. That's kind of what happens to the bats. So disturbance can really cause a problem for hibernating bats. There are also bats that use caves and mines for their maternity sites. So there are bats that use caves year-round, and you can actually, human disturbance can actually cause female bats to abandon their roost and abandon their pups. So that's another way that human disturbance can disrupt bat populations. Wind energy is really important, and sustainable energy, developing sustainable energy sources is really important. It's something that we definitely need to focus on. Unfortunately, with wind energy causes some problems for bats. Bats can be killed by turbines, and actually hundreds of thousands of bats and birds are killed each year by wind turbines. The good news is, with at least for bats, is that we know that we can address a lot of that mortality, so we can reduce a lot of the number of bats that are killed by wind turbines by curtailing their operations. So times when there's really low wind is a really good time for bats, which is also not the best time for wind energy production. So during low wind events, wind energy producers can reduce the rate that their blades are spinning, or stop the blades from spinning, and actually really reduce the amount of mortality of bats. And the good news is that there's a lot of really good science out there, and a lot of the wind producers are really working with the scientists to figure out how they can help reduce those mortality events for bats and for birds. But I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking about white nose syndrome. This is probably the biggest threat to bats in North America right now. White nose syndrome is a disease. It's affecting hibernating bats. So if you remember, we talked a little bit earlier about the fact that some bats hibernate and some bats migrate. So this is really only affecting those bat species that are hibernators. The disease is caused by a fungus. It's a cold-loving fungus, so it only can survive from about 41 to 57 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures much higher than that kill the fungus. So I forgot to mention when I was talking about hibernation that bats' body temperature when they're normal and active is about like ours. It's in the mid-90s to upper 90s. When they go into hibernation, they lower their body temperature down to about what the temperature is in the caves or mines where they're hibernating, which is usually in the mid-50s, 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So right in that range where the fungus can grow. It doesn't affect pets or humans because our bodies are just too warm and the fungus can't grow on us. But this disease has extremely high mortality rates. It kills up to 90%, sometimes more, of the bats and caves that are affected. It's also affecting multiple species of bats, so that's a little bit unusual for wildlife diseases. And I just want to mention again that it's not really a threat to humans or pets or livestock because our body temperatures are really too warm for it. And I apologize, the spacing on my slides got messed up a little bit when I sent it to Deb to put online, so you'll notice there's a couple like mistakes here and there, but I think you guys can get the idea. You guys, I think, probably have learned about the disease triangle, the 3 things that are needed for there to be a disease. That's a pathogen, a suitable environment, and a host. So for this disease, I'll talk a little bit about the pathogen. Again, it's this fungus. It grows exactly where bats, in the temperature range where bats are when they're hibernating. The fungus actually invades the skin tissue. We call it white nose syndrome because when they first were discovering it, they noticed that a lot of the bats had white fuzzy fungus growing on their faces. But it actually grows on other parts of their body too, their wing tissue, their ears, basically anywhere there's no fur. We've also found this fungus in Europe and Asia, and the bats there, while they sometimes develop the disease, they don't usually die from it. So that's one of the things that scientists are focusing on, is looking at why the European and Asian bats live in caves with this fungus, with this disease, and don't die, and the bats in North America do. So hopefully that's one way that we may be able to get some clues as to what is going on with this disease and how we might help bats survive. The next part of the disease triangle is the environment. So it needs a suitable environment. Caves provide a perfect environment for the fungus. They stay relatively stable temperature. They have high humidity. This map here is an overlay of the caves in the United States. So the red part is where caves are, and the yellow part, this map's a couple years old, but this is where the fungus was found, where the disease was found. So you can see that we first discovered the disease in a cave in upstate New York, and it spread right down the line of where the caves are going, and it's continuing to spread. And then we need a host, and that's our bats, unfortunately. So we have, like I said, 47 species of bats here in the US. About half of those hibernate and half of them migrate. But so far right now, we've found that 7 different species of bats in the United States are affected by white nose syndrome. So that's getting close to almost half of the hibernating bat species in the US. And I don't think I can move that photo, I'm sorry. So we know that bats are spreading the disease from bat to bat. So we know that if bats are in a cave or a mine, they have the fungus, they have the disease on them, they can spread it to other bats in that site. But we also have concerns that humans can inadvertently spread the fungus. So people going into these sites, whether it's scientific researchers or biologists, or people that are going into caves or mines to explore, we can get the fungus on our shoes, on our clothing, on our backpacks, and we can also take that fungus out. So bats do move quite a far distance on the landscape because they can fly, but humans move a lot further. So the concern is that people can move the fungus a lot quicker and a lot further than the bats are naturally moving the fungus. Okay, so this is a map right now of where the disease is in the United States. You can see there's a little red circle in upstate New York there. That's where the disease was discovered. And now all these counties that are all the different colored dots are counties that have sites that have white nose syndrome. So there might be 1 cave or there might be 50 caves in a county that have white nose syndrome. This last year in winter of 2016, unfortunately, we found white nose syndrome in Washington State, where I live. And you can see on the map that there's a big gap in between where the fungus is in the Midwest, which is sort of like the leading edge of the disease spreading, and Washington State. So it's not likely that we're going to ever figure out exactly how the fungus got here. But now that it's here, it certainly changes the way that wildlife biologists and scientists are thinking about bat conservation efforts. So I just want to talk a little bit about what happens when this disease gets into a colony of hibernating bats. Here's a couple of graphs that show what happened to some of the colonies in New York. You can see before white nose syndrome, they had pretty good numbers of bats in them. And then after the disease arrived and was there for just a couple of years, we saw big crashes in those populations. Here's a picture you can see. This is actually Indiana bats. They are hibernating in their cave. Indiana bats can cram in really tight when they're hibernating. So if you had a shoebox, you could actually fit about 300 Indiana bats hibernating in a shoebox. That's how tight they squish together when they're hibernating. And they also like to go back to the same place to hibernate year after year. So you can see this photo has been taken in the same spot. The first two pictures are right before white nose syndrome got to that cave. And then the second two pictures are after the disease was there for a few years. So you can see that it's had a really big effect on that colony of bats. The first time I ever went somewhere that had white nose syndrome was this cave in Vermont called Mount Aeolus Cave. And it's one of the biggest bat caves in the northeastern U.S. It historically had about 300,000 bats in it. And this one room, right when you walk into the cave, usually had about 1,000 to 3,000 bats in it. And I went there in 2010, and there were only 35 bats left. And I put these pictures in just because I wanted you to see, this is on the floor of the cave. The bats that died from the disease had just fallen down to the floor and were decaying on the floor. A lot of times we don't even see the bats because they'll fly out. They're going out and searching for food in the winter when there is none. And unfortunately, a lot of them die outside of the cave and we never know that they're gone. So what does this mean for bats? They've done some modeling to look at if this disease continues the way it is, what do we think is going to happen to some of our bat populations? This graph is showing one specific kind of bat, Myotis lucifagus, which is the little brown bat, which is probably the most widespread bat in North America. And based on the types of mortality that we have seen, it's predicted that we could actually have localized extinctions of that bat in the next 10 years. So places that the disease has been for a few years, it's likely that we are going to not have sustainable populations of those bats anymore. So big picture, what does that mean? Well, like we talked about before, bats are the primary predator of night-flying insects. That includes lots of forest and crop pests. There's been some studies done. Recently, they looked at what that would mean just for corn farmers in the U.S. And they find that bats could provide up to $1 billion of pest control services just for corn here in the U.S. So without bats, those farmers are going to have to apply a lot more pesticides and deal with a lot more damage to their crops. We don't really know what some of those impacts might be to the forest products industry. They're working on some models on that, but a lot of these pests that bats eat are actually pests that impact trees that we use for forest products, for paper, for building, and things like that. And of course, those additional pesticide uses could have other effects too, so that in addition to just costing farmers a lot more money, pesticides could potentially have impacts to the environment and human health. Hibernating bats are also an important part of cave ecosystems because the caves are dark, they don't have any sunlight, there's no plants growing in there, there's not a lot of nutrients coming into the cave system. But bats actually bring lots of nutrients in their waste products and their guano. And that supports a lot of things like crickets and in their waste products and their guano. And that supports a lot of things like crickets and other small insects and arthropods, which then can support things like amphibians, frogs, salamanders, and things like that. So bats are a really important part of that system. So what are we doing about it? We're working together, all the state and federal agencies, tribes, researchers in the U.S. are cooperating on trying to respond to this disease. We've got a lot of research going on. We're looking for ways that we might develop treatments for this disease. We're looking for ways that we might help protect different habitat areas and things like that. We have developed some decontamination guidance. So for either scientists and researchers or for cave explorers, if you're going into caves, we now know different ways that you can actually kill that fungus. So if you go into a cave, you want to make sure you decontaminate your clothing and your footwear and your gear so that you don't accidentally bring that fungus to a new cave and infect a new population. We're also looking at things like whether caves should be closed certain times of year when bats are in there to human explorers, so that we're not disturbing bats, we're not giving them, or not affecting their ability to survive when they're healthy, and then if they get the disease, they're going to be even more soft. And we're also looking at things like captive management. It's really hard to keep insectivorous bats alive in captivity. If you ever go to a zoo or something, you won't really see many insectivorous bats. What you'll see usually are vampire bats or fruit-eating bats, because they're a lot easier to keep in captivity. So they are exploring ways to see if they can keep bats in captivity to try to help keep those populations sustained while we work on other ways that we might address the disease. Protecting and conserving habitat, whether that's protecting forested areas, protecting caves, protecting old buildings and barns where we know bats may be, or if we're going to affect some of that habitat, looking at ways that we might offset some of that so that we can be protecting those bats. So if you want to help bats, there's a couple things that you can do. You can educate yourself and others. A lot of times people think bats are gross and scary, and unfortunately a lot of people will kill bats if they find them in their house. So it's really important to talk to people about bats and let them know that they're really important and that they need to be protected. You can provide bats with safe roosting habitat, things like bat houses. You can find plans online and build one yourself, put it up at your school or your house. You can take note of bats in your area. If you see a colony of bats, or if you notice at night bats coming out of an old building or something like that, it's really important that you report those to your state wildlife agency, because that helps us better understand where bats are and the types of habitat that they're using. And if you do see bats behaving oddly, so if you see bats flying around in the daytime or roosting outside in the daytime, that's unusual for bats. So that's another way that you can alert your state wildlife agency that something might be going on with bats in your area. If you do like to explore caves, you should always check with your state conservation agency before you go into caves and mines to make sure that there's not a closure in place to protect bats. And if you do go in caves and mines, you should always decontaminate your footwear and gear before and after your visit. And you can find those decontamination protocols online if you search for white nose syndrome and decontamination. Bats can carry diseases. Some bats do carry rabies, a very, very small percentage. 0.5% of wild bats carry rabies. But it's really important that you don't touch bats, because the only way that we can test for rabies is to kill the bat. So if you touch a bat and you get bitten, it could be a healthy bat and it could have just been trying to defend itself. But the only way we'll be able to tell if that bat has rabies is to kill it. So really you're protecting bats by not touching them. If you see a bat, you should always go get an adult and they can figure out how to safely move the bat if it needs to be moved. Teach people to care about bats. That's really the most important thing you can do. And that's my presentation. I know we've got a couple questions over here. Let me go over and take a look at that. Okay. So we learned about the biomass pyramid and the flow of energy. We understand the 10% rule and how mass, matter, and energy is passed on to the next level. But if they eat their body weight each day, they must be more than 10% efficient. Well, one reason that bats have to eat so much food is because they fly, and flying is really energy intensive. They use way more energy flying than most animals use by walking or slithering or some of the other ways that bats move around. They also, because they echolocate, that uses a lot of energy too. We can't actually hear their echolocation. It's above our hearing range, but if we could hear it, what I understand is that it's about the same level of sound as a car horn honking. So these little tiny animals are making this huge amount of sound to echolocate. So they use a lot more energy in their flight and in echolocation than many animals do in their day-to-day activity. Also, because they're mammals, when mammals are lactating, when they're producing milk, that uses a lot more energy than usual too. So some of those numbers, eating up to their body weight in insects, that's most likely going to be mothers that are trying to feed young and need additional energy to produce their milk to feed their young. Okay, question from Brittany. Does the mother bat pass her immune system to her offspring like a human mother does? That's a really good question. I would assume so. I don't know that for certain, but I would assume that mammals all sort of similarly pass some of their immunity onto their offspring. But that's a good one. I'll have to look that up so that I know the answer to that next time. Do I have a favorite bat? Oh, yes, I actually have about 1,300 favorite bats. No, I'm just kidding. I have lots of favorite bats for lots of different reasons, but one of my favorite bats is actually called a pallid bat, and they live in the western U.S., and they have this really beautiful sort of white, soft, glossy fur and these really gigantic ears, and they use those really big ears actually to listen for footsteps of their prey. And these guys like to eat scorpions and centipedes and crickets and things that are walking around on the ground. So they actually use these big giant ears to listen for things like scorpions walking around, and that's how they find their prey. So that's one of my favorite bats. And interestingly, they can get stung by the scorpions and it doesn't seem to bother them. So I think they're pretty cool. Okay, we learned that some bats live under the bark of trees too. Is that true? Yes, it is. So I know I talked a lot about caves and mines, but most bats use caves and mines only in the winter, although there are some bats that use caves and mines year-round. But most bats during the spring, summer, and fall will leave those caves and mines where they've been hibernating, and they'll go out into the forest. And lots of bats roost under loose tree bark. They'll roost in holes in trees. They'll roost in big empty snags. They will roost in live trees. There's actually a bat called a hoary bat, and when they curl up in a little ball, they have this kind of like grayish white tipped fur, and they like to roost in some evergreen trees, and they blend in really well with like the pine cones and stuff. It's pretty amazing. They have great camouflage going on. So yeah, lots of bats live under the bark of trees. So that's another thing you can do to help protect bats is if you have, if you know somebody that has a dead tree on their property that's not in a place that is dangerous for a building or for people, you could encourage them to leave that tree standing there, because that sloughing bark, those big flaps of bark that are loose, provide really great habitat for bats. Okay, let's see. What is your coolest bat or cave experience and or scariest experience? That's a really great question. Let's see, my coolest cave experience is probably going to a cave in Texas called Bracken Cave, and it's home to the biggest colony of Mexican free-tailed bats in the U.S. They think there's somewhere between 10 and 20 million bats in this cave. So it's actually also the largest congregation of mammals on Earth, which is pretty amazing. And I got to go there to do some work, and one of my favorite things was sitting right outside the entrance of that cave in the evening when all the bats started coming out, and it was just awesome to see hundreds of thousands of bats flying over me. My scariest experience was probably when I was doing some work in a cave down in Mexico, in Baja, Mexico, and if you're a little bit creeped out by caves, this cave might have been extra creepy because it was in a cemetery. So we had to go into a cave in a cemetery, and it had a really long, skinny passage that you had to crawl on your belly to get through. And there were lots of insects in there, including cockroaches. And so that was pretty scary for me to crawl through there with all these cockroaches everywhere. I knew they weren't going to hurt me, but I felt a little bit like Indiana Jones with all those snakes. That's kind of how I felt about those cockroaches. Okay, how did you become a bat expert? You know, it is hard to get a job like you have, so how did you prepare for your job or get your job? What skills or education did you have to complete? Okay, so I studied natural resources in college, and I have a master's degree in natural resources. I took lots of classes in wildlife biology, and before I worked for Fish and Wildlife Service, I actually worked for the National Park Service. And I worked in the wildlife department there, and that's how I started doing bat survey work. So I started going out in the winter to caves and mines to count bats. And then in the spring, summer, and fall, I would go out with researchers that were capturing bats and tagging them and learning about them. So some of that I did on my own time. I volunteered because I wanted to learn more about bats, and that's one thing I would definitely suggest is you can always look and see if there's some sort of organization near you that works with bats and see if you can volunteer there. You might not be handling bats, but you can certainly learn a lot more about them and make some connections with people that may be doing bat research. And there are some, like I said, there's some universities that have programs that work with bats. So you could go into something like wildlife biology or ecology and do coursework at a university that has field-based classes. And that would be another way that you might be able to connect with folks that are doing bat research. Okay, let's see. Deb, you would not like the cockroaches. I can agree. Okay, do we use mist nets to catch bats like birders use during spring counts? Yeah, actually we do use mist nets. Sometimes we use mist nets, and sometimes we use a different kind of thing called a harp trap, which is it's like a big square thing with really thin like fishing wire strung across it like a harp, like the musical instrument. And we can use that in front of a small opening like a cave entrance or a mine entrance, or if bats are coming out of one hole in the side of a barn or something. And they hit those strings that are strung across the harp trap, and they fall down into a little basket that we can collect them from. But we do often use mist nets too. It's really interesting if you've ever seen people trying to get birds out of mist nets. Bats are even more difficult to get out of mist nets because they are even sometimes smaller and more delicate than a lot of the birds that we deal with. Whitney, are we seeing any improvement in bat populations or not really? Well, I should have included a slide, and I'll remember to do this for next year, that there are actually some small populations of bats that are hanging on in some of the areas that have been really impacted by Wegener syndrome. So that's really good news. They're very small remnant populations. We're not exactly sure why they're surviving when others aren't, and that's something we're studying quite a bit to see if we can figure out why those bats are living and other bats that live in and around that area are not. Unfortunately, because bats are really slow reproducers, they only have usually one, sometimes two pups a year. They're not improving their population or repopulating very quickly. So hopefully we will at some point have these small populations and be able to kind of figure out how to best protect them. But that makes it even more important that we continue to work to help protect bat habitat. So those bats that are surviving, they have the best chance possible to survive this disease. Okay, Deb was wondering if there are any states or nations that are doing great things for bats and acting good practices or policies. So I can say here in the U.S., a lot of the states are doing really great things for bats. I think in part because of white nose syndrome, people are a lot more aware. So a lot of states are working a lot more to protect bat habitat, whether that's caves or forested areas that we know bats are using. They're spending more money on their state wildlife agencies working on understanding bats and working with Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies to make sure that we're protecting bats. There are some great things going on internationally as well. There's an organization called Bat Conservation International, and they work with a lot of other countries. So, for example, I just saw a story. They're working in Fiji to protect some of the bats there. So there's lots of different countries that are doing things, whether that's protecting habitat or protecting individual bat colonies and things like that to try to help conserve bats. Brittany asks, if we didn't have bats, what would be the impact on our ecosystems? Well, most likely if we didn't have bats, it would take a little while for us to realize it, but there would be nobody out there to eat tons and tons of insects. So long term, there could potentially be insect populations that would continue to get larger and have impacts on our forests, have impacts on our agriculture, and things like that. Also, some of those other species that depend on bats that live in the caves and mines and things like that would be in trouble without bats. They wouldn't have bats bringing nutrients into the cave system. So things like cave fish and cave crickets and cave crawfish and all these species that are really cool that only live in caves might be in trouble if they didn't have bats to help bring nutrients into those ecosystems. So probably the biggest impacts would be to our forests and to agriculture, although it might take a while for us to realize that, and we manipulate those ecosystems quite a bit already. But there would be a lot of localized impacts in caves and mines and places that have bat populations long term. Okay, what eats bats, or are they the apex predators? Actually, lots of things eat bats. Snakes eat bats, hawks eat bats, owls eat bats, skunks and raccoons and lots of small mammals will eat bats. That cave I was talking about before with the millions of bats in it, one of the things that happens at sunset, right when the bats start coming out, is actually birds start coming in, like hawks and owls, and they start circling around and waiting for those bats to come out. And they'll pick bats off as they're coming out of the cave. Snakes will do the same thing. They'll actually sit on a ledge and wait for bats to come out and grab the bats as they're coming out. Okay, we got a few more minutes. Do we have any more questions? Or did I not answer any questions that anyone had? Did I miss any? Of course. Well, I'm so glad to have been able to join you guys again. And if you have any questions that come up later, Deb, you're always welcome to send questions my way if people have questions they think about later after the presentation today. I do travel quite a bit, but I will check my email and I promise to get back to you if you have any questions. And I will certainly let you know if I come to Chicago. Thanks. I'm going to disconnect. Bye.